Hello and welcome to the private room, exclusively for readers of the book, A Nurse Practitioner's Guide to Autoimmune Medicine, Reversing and Preventing All Autoimmunity. And we're very fortunate to have with us Christina Stapke, dietitian and specialist in integrative and functional nutrition. And I gotta tell you, she is one of the best I've ever, if not the best I've ever met. So we're so fortunate to have her. Welcome, Christina.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Excited to be here.
So what I want to do is start out, if you don't mind, give us some insights into the standard American diet, which is nicknamed the SAD diet because it is so sad. And our tendency to eat highly processed foods, which I think is really a misnomer. I think it's more food-like products because I don't even think we should call them food, and why that's so bad for folks if they want to stay healthy long-term, but also why it's impossible to turn around this chronic health issues if you don't change away from that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, the description of it being sad is perfect. Unfortunately, it's yeah, our diet is highly processed. So a lot of our foods come out of a bag or a box, or a freezer box or something, and oftentimes those foods are very low in nutrients, very low in fiber, very high in sodium. And overall are just not good for us. So overall our diet, so whether or not it's from a bag or a box, again, low in fiber and color. We also have a very high intake of refined oils. Oftentimes they are from GMO crops. So things like, canola, cottonseed, soybean oils, very inflammatory and refined, and very ubiquitous in our system right now. Also, our proteins are fairly poor given our food system and how we're raising livestock. Oftentimes, they're fed food that they shouldn't be eating. Oftentimes, GMO crops as well, given hormones, antibiotics, and those are generally can be really inflammatory for our bodies as well. And also, we have a consistent use of pesticides as well, and also, like I mentioned, GMOs, glyphosate, that weed killer to grow massive quantities of different crops as well. Also, different harmful additives are in a lot of our foods. So all of these things essentially can result in a host of different health issues, including blood sugar dysregulation, inflammation, poor nutrient status, because the nutrient density of our food is typically poor, poor microbiome diversity. So our gut microbiomes really need a lot of fiber and color to really thrive, and ideally, aren't going to be hit by antibiotics and different toxins from our food as well. So all of these things can really create a perfect storm for chronic disease and autoimmune disease. So essentially, we can think of it at least partially by thinking of, if we're nutrient depleted, our body is not going to have all the tools it needs to self-regulate. That includes the immune system and autoimmunity. And again, if it keeps getting hit from inflammatory sources, that inflammatory trigger can really feed into autoimmune disease as well. So essentially, those are the key points of kind of why the standard American diet is not optimal, and why we definitely need to shift to kind of more whole foods eating. And we'll talk about some specific diets further along in this interview as well.
Fantastic. Those are great insights. And I have to say, we're kind of a country or a world of messed up guts too. So that people, even if they're trying to eat, better, they may not be getting the bang for their effort until we start fixing some things. And then they can start getting the bang for their effort, including there's a lot of insights that somebody like yourself would be able to share with somebody who thinks they're eating healthy that would, be, mind-blowing to them, and they would really get a chance to kick things into gear with the kind of information that you can share.
Absolutely, I totally agree. Yeah, sometimes people will try and eat whole foods, like plenty of vegetables, but their gut is not in the right place to do that. Yeah, but absolutely, it's definitely something to consider.
So in the book, we talk about how everybody with an autoimmune disease had problems with the wheat protein, 62 different kinds, Gluten's one, and the proteins in cows, milk, dairy products. We also talk about butter is okay, but perhaps non-GMO and organic butter would be okay. Can you talk about why the proteins in those foods tend to be problematic? And we also ask people initially that if they haven't gotten rid of those two together at any point, well, let's do that first, see how you feel before going further with like specific testing or elimination diet, these kind of things. Can you talk about why those proteins are so problematic, but also some strategies that the practitioners could use to help their patients kind of avoid those two together for a while?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a host of reasons why these proteins are problematic. So I'm just going to cover a couple of them. But so wheat in particular, it has a ton of different compounds that people can be very sensitive to and can be pro-inflammatory. So, for example, wheat germ agglutinin, that is a lectin component of wheat, that can actually cross the intestinal barrier and trigger inflammation in the body. Also, gluten, a component of wheat, can contribute to increased zonulin expression, which can essentially increase intestinal permeability, kind of making us more susceptible to food triggers, to infections, to toxins that can kind of trigger that immune and autoimmune cascade. So those are two components of wheat in particular. As far as kind of brainstorming strategies when someone is trying to go wheat-free, oftentimes, I mean, I typically recommend before, like if someone is really dependent on kind of eating wheat or and gluten for every single meal, I usually just have them commit to doing a week because some people are really overwhelmed by like a whole month. And so once I have them commit to that, I give some recipe ideas, really just giving people confidence that gluten-free can taste real, or wheat-free can still taste very good. I have people focus on whole foods as well. So I typically tell people, if you can imagine it growing or living in nature, that's considered a whole food. And most people are not going out and eating like whole wheat or whole barley or anything like that. It's usually, they're getting that wheat through processed foods, flours, and things like that. So that's kind of where I start, is encourage whole foods. And then I usually give them a list of whole foods carb sources that they can use instead of wheat, for example. So a lot of people are dependent on bread. And so we talk about some examples like potatoes and fruit and other starchy vegetables that they can enjoy instead of that wheat carbohydrate. And so now transitioning to dairy. So dairy in general, the most problematic piece of it is casein. And so it tends to be very allergenic. Also, a lot of people have a hard time digesting dairy after infancy. And in general, most dairy that we raise conventionally can be not really great for our bodies either, because the things that they're feeding the cows and giving antibiotics and all of that can really result in the milk that the cows produce to be quite inflammatory as well. So that's essentially why those things are problematic. When I'm recommending someone go dairy-free, I usually, again, I kind of have them commit to a week because it can be overwhelming. And then from that place, I kind of see what the main sources in their diet are. I found that dairy-free tends to be a little bit easier for people because it isn't as ubiquitous. I mean, a lot of foods will use butter, but not as much use milk in my experience. So people find this a little bit easier unless they're eating cheese like every day. So in that case, I'll recommend some substitutions. Dairy-free cheeses have come a long way. By no means all of them are definitely not good. I wouldn't recommend using anything with soy or anything like that. But I kind of help come up with substitutions for different cheeses, or if they're doing yogurt or alternative milks, if they're still drinking cow's milk. So we kind of just come up with things that taste good. And then, and also recipes that don't include dairy. There's a lot of different things that can taste really good without dairy, and still using butter, by the way. People are always really happy when I tell them you can still use butter or ghee. So those are some things that we kind of talk about. And then as far as wheat-free and gluten and dairy-free, it's also important to consider that these proteins can actually act on opioid receptors in the brain. So for some people, they're way more likely to have it be extremely hard to give up any wheat or dairy. So kind of considering that in the whole picture, there's actually testing you can do to kind of assess that. But if you don't have access to that testing, I usually really make sure I'm supporting nutrition status and supporting neurotransmitters if there is some, addictive component there. So those things are really important. And then also really practicing mindful eating, paying attention to their bodies as they make the change. A lot of people feel so much better once they do limit that food for a certain amount of time. So I really encourage people to kind of, pay attention and notice any differences that they see, because that's honestly, it's can be really encouraging to continue that kind of diet when they do feel a little bit better.
Those are some beautiful points. And I like how you mentioned about the opioid receptors. So a lot of times when I ask people to avoid these two types of proteins initially, I'll ask them how they felt. And it's basically a withdrawal reaction. It's the same when you get when people are coming off the opioid medications. They describe it so much and you're like, yeah, your body's addicted to it. But also when cortisol is affected, and cortisol is always affected by the time we get a chance to see them, is basically you crave the foods that bug you. So like if a parent comes in with a child with a lot of health issues, so like, they may have asthma and allergies and eczema and ADD, ADHD, they can't sleep, which is a classic cortisol disruption in kids. And they tell me that their child will not eat anything but macaroni and cheese and drink milk. And I think they starve when I try to not feeding them that. And instantly I know, oh yeah, they got a wheat and dairy issue. They're totally craving the foods that bug them.
Yeah, absolutely. I know it's kind of, it's upsetting if they're really craving that and then they can't have it, but it's just getting through that period where, we go through that withdrawal and then typically end up feeling really good on the other side of it. So yeah, absolutely. It's interesting and kind of scary.
Well, it is for the parent, kind of like that. But then it's amazing. They come back, and after just a few days, really, like you say, kind of quick, within a few days, the body's recognizing that, well, actually, that made them feel crummy, and other foods make them feel better. And the parent will come back, like, 6 weeks later for the initial follow up and go, you wouldn't believe it. My child came home from school and asked for broccoli. And I'm like, what?
Yeah, that's awesome.
That's great. Well, then I tell you, if you could, before we get into some, common nutritional protocols, like maybe fasting, mimicking, and let's say, avoiding nightshades, can you talk about how you and kind of your profession in general are able to really support people through the process of reversing chronic disease, autoimmune disease, and why it's so important for you guys to be part of that patient journey?
Yeah, absolutely. So what I use in my practice is a 7-step gut restoration protocol. I focus a lot on the gut. And so essentially, and we know how much autoimmune disease is connected to the gut. So yeah, and if anyone wants a visual of this, it's on my website. It's kind of, easy to look through. But so the first step is kind of diving into someone's history. So this really allows us to come up with a targeted plan for what to prioritize in their foundational pieces of health. So that kind of leads to step 2. In our foundations, of course, we really optimize nutrition, get the food piece really, really solid. But we also focus on movement that's suited for their body, stress reduction, sleep, reducing toxin exposure, supporting optimal detox as well. And then oftentimes, I will do some micronutrient testing or organic acid testing to really give us a really comprehensive picture of their nutrient status to support with a, general immune system function. and also just getting them feeling better. I find a lot of people come in and they're so deficient and inflamed that they really need some targeted support with nutrients. And oftentimes that can make a huge difference, and really get people motivated to kind of continue making changes. And then I kind of move on to identifying and addressing triggers. So oftentimes I will recommend a peptide level food sensitivity testing if it hasn't been done already by their practitioner. And if it has been done already, then we can really support with providing recipes, giving patients tools for meal planning, giving them a starter meal plan if they need that at the beginning. Ultimately, my goal and job for them is to give them the tools to be successful on their own eventually, while of course giving them the support they need in the meantime. So we look at identifying and addressing triggers. And then from that point, if it hasn't been done already, then I'll typically look at identifying or addressing pathogens. So doing some gut microbiome testing. Again, if it has been done already, then I can really support patients with supplement adherence or any kind of herbal protocols that they're on, and then brainstorming or troubleshooting if any issues arise. And then from that point, we move into reinoculating and repairing the gut. So if, herbals or antibiotics have been used, so really supporting the gut with key nutrients to kind of help that gut lining heal and help reduce any permeability, so we can really prevent the risk of any additional food sensitivities or any other triggering of the immune system from the gut, especially. And then at that point, we kind of move into potentially reintroducing restricted foods if appropriate. For example, if someone comes back with 30 different food sensitivities, with the exception of dairy, gluten, or wheat, I'll definitely want to add those foods back in as much as it's appropriate, depending on kind of how long they've been out for. And also throughout this whole process, making sure the patient is really supported in their relationship with food, their mindset around food. Oftentimes, if they do get too restricted, the relationship with food can kind of be skewed. So really supporting them through that process as well. And then finally, we kind of get to a place of maintenance. If people are feeling really good, we come up with a plan for how to keep things in balance, diet and lifestyle strategies to kind of keep their gut in good shape and their immune system in good shape. And if they're not really at that place, then we kind of brainstorm what other testing needs to be done. So there's a lot of different avenues we can go down from that point. And then kind of through this process, typically a lot of my patients just feel a lot better. Their gut symptoms are improved. They feel more confident around eating, very in tune with their bodies. And really, I love this part, really excited about functional medicine and nutrition too, because they've kind of seen that this approach is so different and can be so helpful. So essentially that's my role. And I know a lot of functional dietitians kind of work in similar ways.
Well, thank you so much. And I love what you mentioned about maintaining health, because it's so important for us to do what we need to do to get somebody feeling great. But then you want to keep them great the rest of their life. You don't want to like be backsliding and have to do this all over again, or prevent, as you're doing this, you're preventing cancer and Alzheimer's and dementia and diabetes. So really, this is really the best way not only to turn around these autoimmune diseases and chronic disease, but really the best way to do preventative medicine as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So could you tell us now maybe about some of the common nutritional protocols that you tend to use in people with the autoimmune diseases?
Yeah, absolutely. And if any of you want to go and reference this, you can just Google. Dr. Bilstrom has it on his blog. I think it's just Dr. Bilstrom Autoimmune Diet Protocols. There's a full summary for kind of a written summary of all of this. I think the very first thing that I definitely take a look at when I'm recommending any kind of protocol is what is someone's relationship with food? Do they have history of eating disorder? Are they currently in an active eating disorder? What level of restriction is appropriate? I typically like to go from least restrictive to most, only if it's needed. We kind of talked about the importance of wheat and cow's milk restriction as much as possible with autoimmune disease, but there are a few other ones that can be really helpful as well. So essentially my job as well, outside of assessing relationship with food, is ensuring nutrient adequacy and balance while someone's doing a protocol like this, helping with recipe ideas and meal planning if they do need some support with that. And then, yeah, again, supporting a positive relationship with food and their body through the whole process of the elimination or whatever protocol we're working on. So a couple common ones are, I'm actually going to go through three or four. So one really popular one right now is intermittent fasting. And then another one kind of under the umbrella of intermittent fasting is a fasting mimicking diet. So intermittent fasting, typically it can be done several different ways, but one common way is to essentially not eat or fast for 16 hours and then have an 8-hour period where you can eat. And then there's also things like, full 24-hour long fasting. Of course, when we're kind of deciding whether to incorporate this, I think it's super important to figure out whether someone is really, really stressed, like overly stressed, because doing excessive fasting can just serve as another stress on the body and can really impact the adrenal glands. So kind of taking that into account. Another diet protocol is the fasting mimicking diet. I find that this can be a little bit more feasible for people because essentially it consists of a 3 to 5 day long period each month where someone consumes a very low amount of calories. So it's not necessarily time restricted, but it's more so focusing on plenty of healthy fats and fairly low protein and carbohydrate. And then most protein should come from plant sources in this protocol, of course, minding sensitivities or any intolerances. Sea salt can be used for this too. And so, yeah, that's essentially a summary of the fasting mimicking and intermittent fasting protocols. And there's a lot of good research on kind of how that can really support autophagy and support immune regulation and the overall, and calm really the overall autoimmune process. Another protocol that's becoming a little bit more popular is popularized by Dr. Gundry is the low lectin protocol. I've actually seen a lot of people improve with that recently. And so lectins are essentially a compound found in things like legumes, whole grains, certain nuts as well, certain vegetables. So these are essentially considered an anti-nutrient, these lectins, and they can bind to certain minerals, especially to kind of prevent their absorption. There's definitely some research that connect lectins triggering inflammation. We definitely need some more research on this, but overall, the body essentially can look at lectin and see it as a foreign invader, and then can attack your own tissue and kind of can trigger that autoimmune process as well. So doing that restriction can be helpful in some people. The next kind of diet protocol is nightshade free. So nightshades are food category consisting of tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, white potatoes, certain spices like paprika, cayenne, and they contain a compound called alkaloids. So this typically, this is something that we need some more research on. I've definitely seen people improve so much with nightshade free that, it's enough for me to recommend just doing a trial to see if people feel better. While there is some research on this kind of approach as well. The last one is the autoimmune protocol, or also known as autoimmune paleo. So this is probably one of the most restrictive protocols there is. So I would, and I didn't mention this earlier, but I would also kind of assess before recommending a certain protocol for someone, assessing if this is really the right time to try this in their life. Do they have uh, endless things that they're trying to juggle? Is this like, are they just trying to get by? Are they just trying to remember to eat? Right? Like people like that, it might not be a good idea to put them on a super, super restrictive protocol unless they have plenty of support and they feel very willing and ready. So the autoimmune protocol, essentially there are several different foods that are restricted, including legumes, whole grains, nuts and seeds, nightshades, basically all the things that we've talked about kind of put into one. And so yeah, essentially the goal of this is to eliminate the foods for 30 to 90 days and then reintroducing each food group essentially one at a time, separated by 5 to 7 days to kind of assess symptoms. Ultimately, I know, Dr. Bilstrom, you talked about doing food sensitivity testing in your book. I really feel like going off of that data can be really helpful versus restricting all of these different foods, because it can be extremely overwhelming for people. But again, if someone's willing to do it, then I'm there to support them. And some people have a lot of success. As far as the research goes, we're still kind of getting more research about how it can help people with autoimmune disease. There's a couple studies, smaller studies on looking at individuals with inflammatory bowel disease and having some success with that. But yeah, overall, at the end of the day, figure out what the patient is willing to do. Definitely make sure they have support from a dietitian or nutritionist. And so those are my biggest recommendations for all those protocols.
Well, thank you. That's fantastic. Now, as we're talking to the nurse practitioners who will become the experts in reversing and preventing all autoimmune disease in their community, as time goes on, what they're going to see is people who are seek them out, who have already done a lot of reading on their own, a lot of research on their own, and they've already sort of said, I'm going to do this autoimmune paleo, I'm going to do this and this super restrictive stuff, right? And the thing is, though, I think is everybody's such a unique individual that people do those kind of protocols, and some people go, oh my gosh, that's the greatest thing ever, I feel great. There's a lot of people that do it and go, oh my gosh, I'm so frustrated because I don't feel great. And this is where we kind of pull back and make it a tad easier, where we say, hey, let's do this food sensitivity test. We'll be able to pinpoint exactly which ones are bugging and how much. And a lot of times it turns out to be a lot less restrictive. But what they've done is, they've gotten rid of some of the things that bug them as an individual, but they haven't gotten rid of some other things because that's not supposed to bug people, but it bugs some people and it bugs them and they can't get where they want to. And they actually kind of like it where you're a little bit less restrictive, but if you can pinpoint exactly what's going on, then you're in a position to fix all this. And then to your point, be in a position to reintroduce them eventually once the reason why they develop these sensitivities is corrected, which is the gut stuff. And now they can actually reintroduce them, including, we talk about in the book how you can even reset the cow's milk dairy proteins, even though inherently they have those negative aspects of them. Now the body is so sturdy and strong and healthy, it just takes so much more to throw them off once they're able to get their gut in that really great place.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I'm definitely a big proponent of testing, unless someone, again, is like fully in the diet and wants to do it and just wants my support. Testing can make it a lot easier.
Well, fantastic. Well, I wonder if you could talk about, and I think this will be such cool information to share. Can you talk about how you're able to, recommend nutritional changes based on the specific lab results from a patient's workup, and how you do that from Seattle for your patients that are all over the country too?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, depending on kind of what the results show, if we're talking about standard lab testing, whether it be nutrients or just standard blood work, CBC, CMPs, we can really, first of all, if we're talking about nutrients, I can really support patients with repleting their levels, not only from foods and kind of, brainstorming recipes and things that are very dense in those specific nutrients, but also with supplements that are most absorbable, and also consider their genomics in some cases. So if we do have that genomic data, sometimes it is really helpful, and I have seen it helpful in practice to really use that to kind of tailor recommendations for what forms of nutrients that they should be on. So that's one thing. And then there's also, I mean, whenever we're using nutrient supplementation, there's always going to be an interplay of nutrients in our body. So as we're supplementing, we could potentially be depleting one as we supplement with the other. So, leave that up to me or the dietitian to kind of take control of that and monitor all of that, because it can be kind of a lot to monitor. So just doing testing for that. Sometimes I do recommend additional testing to kind of check their levels if we are supplementing in one area. For example, certain minerals can deplete each other. B vitamins, we want to make sure, everything's kind of in balanced amounts. So we can do a lot of different things like micronutrient testing. I often use white blood cell and serum and paired with organic acids to kind of make sure I'm filling in any gaps in their current regimen. And from Seattle, I mean, I'm 100% virtual, and I can easily get set up in states throughout the US. Currently, I'm set up in 6 different states, and I can order the testing. I can monitor patients virtually, of course, adjust supplement regimens, easily communicate with practitioners and doctors from here. That's the beauty of virtual. And, what we've learned from COVID is that, we can be pretty flexible in that way. So yeah, that's essentially how I can support people here, and the things that I think about with nutritional strategies and lab testing.
And can you give people your website information, please?
Yeah, it's Christina Stapke, RDN.com. My last name is spelled Stapke.
Well, thank you so much, Christina, for sharing all your knowledge, which is so appreciative. And now, everyone, just like it says in the song and like it says in the book, got a revolution, got to revolution. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, Christina, once again, you nailed it.
Thanks.